whips in the dungeon. I'm Dex, and this is my clickbait bunny, my little coton de Toulier. We're going to let her down, and then we're going to talk about recipes tonight. We're going to talk about whipped lasagna. What do I mean by whipped lasagna? Well, as you get into whips, which obviously you are, or you wouldn't be watching this channel, you're going to find that different whip makers around the world make whips using a different recipe. What do I mean by that? Well, it's the way the build is put together. And just like a lasagna has layers, and everybody kind of has their own way of building lasagna, the same is true of whips. So I've got just 4 random examples of whips, and they all have different builds. So we're going to talk a little bit about whipped lasagna, then I'm going to have a separate video where I talk specifically just about the Turk's head. But when you look at a whip has different components. And for those of you that haven't seen my earlier videos, we'll go over them real quickly. But all single tails have a heel knot. Sometimes this will be called a pommel, and yeah, you can use it for impact play. But it's actually a Turk's head type of knot. Some people will also call this knot a pineapple knot, which is a variant of a Turk's head. Okay, and Turk's heads can be tied in different sizes. And the other video, we're going to talk about the size of the Turk's head and how that fits into the palm of your hand and what size Turk's head might be good for your hand and how you would know what to ask a whip maker for. So some of the things that are in whipped lasagna is the top layer, and that's what everybody sees. Everyone sees what's called the overlay, and most of the whips I own are 16 plat, but generally speaking in the dungeon you're going to see 12 and 16 plat. Some of the people that really get into whips might have higher plat count whips. Like this little Signal is a 20 plat whip. I have some that are 24 and 32, but those higher plat count whips are collector's whips. Your general working whip in the dungeon is 12 or 16 plat, and that's the overlay. But what is inside of this whip? That's really what we're talking about with whipped lasagna. So I'm going to go over real quickly some different types of builds that you might run into. Signal whip, for example. Signal whip's going to have a shot-loaded core, then a bolster over that core, and then a binding that binds that core and makes it smooth and straight. And then most of them are just single belly. So there'll be a single belly put over that and another bolster, and then your overlay. Okay, and that's kind of a common signal whip build. But within that lasagna, there are some variations. I mean, a whip maker might leave a bolster out. A whip maker that's trying to make a slim profile whip might split his stranding or her stranding. So there are differences even within signal whips. Okay. Then the way a signal whip is finished is another variation in the lasagna. The traditional signal whip cracker was platted directly into the tip of the thong, but in modern times, most of your dungeon-friendly signal whip builders are finishing their signal whip with an English eye, which is what the way this one is made, and that allows you to change your cracker out. So that's always good for signal whip lasagna. This little snake whip, very interesting little whip. Again, a different lasagna. This whip will have a shot-loaded core, has a single bolster, and then a 16 plat overlay. And the overlay is very beautiful work. Very, very beautiful work. Single diamond, whiskey saddle tan, and what I call a variegated herringbone or a variegated whipmaker's plat. But a very small Turk's head. This Turk's head's only about 28 millimeters. Okay, and then again, I'm going to talk about the Turk's head in a future video. Of course, a snake will end with a fall. The fall's important. A white hide fall, I find, tends to not hold conditioner well. So I prefer red hide or latigo, or even some whip makers are using water buffalo. Buffalo makes a wonderful fall. But your most common falls are going to be white hide, red hide, or latigo. And I find that red hide and latigo holds conditioner better and ends up being a better recipe for the lasagna. So when we get into bullwhips, we have, again, different lasagnas. Now I find for snakes and signals, most whip makers are only using one belly and one bolster. They might use two bolsters and a belly before their overlay. When we get to bullwhip builds, there are some whip makers that are doing single belly bullwhips. I personally find a single belly bullwhip after it's been broken in, it's a little bit too agile, a little too loosey-goosey. So I prefer a two belly bullwhip. So there are natural belly builds and there are shot loaded builds. This particular one is a natural two belly build, so it'll have probably a rawhide core, some sort of core coming off the handle, a bolster over that core, the first belly, and here's another variation you'll see in lasagna with whip makers. Some whip makers make that first belly 4 plat, others make it 8 plat, some of them make it 12 plat. That all varies with the whip maker, and it'll change the action a little bit of the whip. Then there'll be a bolster over that belly, and then a second belly. And the second belly usually is a little longer, and it's a higher plat count. And then we have a bolster in the overlay, and you'll see that in this whip, this is a 16 plat overlay, okay? So natural belly though, then of course the fall. So natural belly whip is going to probably be a little bit lighter. It'll crack just as easily because it's not the shot that is making the whip crack, it's this taper of the whip. And this whip has a really good taper. Okay, so another lasagna. Here we've got a whip that actually has got a quite meaty Turk's head, and it's shot loaded. But again, a two belly whip. Great rollout, cracks easily, and just a marvelous whip, but a much different whip than the unloaded whip. And it's all because two different whip makers make their lasagna differently. So I really like that analogy of lasagna. Watch my follow-on video about the Turk's heads and the importance of realizing when you order a whip from a whip maker to give them some idea of the size of the Turk's head you want to end up with, because it'll make a throwing difference for you. And everyone has a little bit different, I don't teach one grip. A lot of whip people say the only way to hold a whip is to put the Turk's head in the palm of your hand and it acts like a ball and socket. And that's certainly the traditional way to hold a whip. But if you come from a poi spinning background or you throw finger floggers, you might decide to grip your whip this way. Again, if you're gripping your whip this way, the diameter of the handle and the size of the Turk's head is going to be an important part of the lasagna when you go to order your whip from the whip maker. Some people like to choke up on their handle and not hold it by the Turk's head. So if you choke up on your handle, then the Turk's head's not as critical a part of the lasagna. Part of this Turk's head too is a well-made whip is going to be balanced, meaning that the balance point or the transition point coming off the handle, the thong and fall are balanced against the handle. So when I grab it here, it has a focal point or a pivot point, right about at the end of the handle to get maximum energy transfer down the thong as the whip's thrown. Okay, so the whip balance is important. You want your whip to be balanced. When a whip maker makes their lasagna, they're cognizant of how much weight they need to put in the heel knot, and a little bit, that'll affect a little bit maybe the size of the heel knot in the Turk's head in order to be able to balance the whip out. Whip lasagna, very, very important topic as you get deeper into whips. Now, if you're a first-time whip buyer, you probably clicked off this video after you saw me put the dog down. If you're really into whips, then you stayed with me to the end. Remember to ring the bell, give us a thumbs up, leave a comment, let me know what you think about whip lasagna. Maybe describe some of the whip builds that you own and share that with the world. As always, thanks for watching Whips in the Dungeon.